So I didn't want to waste a slide on who I am because who cares who I am until you find that I might actually know something. So, but
Better or worse?
Better.
better.
Nice.
Yeah.
Much better.
So my name's Todd Mantell. I am a web developer at legacy.com. Long story short, I was an ASP.NET C# developer, and about 4 or 5 years ago started to get really interested in JavaScript, and sort of through the years ended up becoming pretty passionate about it. And so at Legacy, I started at Legacy less than a year ago, and on a daily basis I do React, Redux, GraphQL, Node, and Express. So I'm here to talk about GraphQL because 2018 is apparently the year of GraphQL. So at least as told by some prominent people in the JS community. So the top person there is a guy named Kyle Simpson, goes by Getify on Twitter. Kyle, if you don't know Kyle, I would imagine many people in here know Kyle. Kyle wrote the fantastic JavaScript series, You Don't Know JS. In my mind, the gold standard of learning JavaScript. If you haven't read them, they're excellent. Kyle said, Kyle is also one of the organizers of the Fluent Conference, which happens in California every spring, summer. Kyle wrote, GraphQL is apparently taking over the world. We had 13 proposals on it for FluentConf. Wow. And the second one is Free Code Camp, Quincy Larson. They do some newsletters and things. Well, they do an online training thing, but they also do a newsletter. And they did a survey of, I think, about 28,000 different JavaScript developers. And their insight was that 2018 will be the year of GraphQL because it was one of the most talked about things in their survey. Now, I plan on spending most of this talk kind of showing you the basics of a GraphQL server, GraphQL queries and mutations, and all those sorts of types and interfaces and that sort of stuff. But before we get there, it's important to talk about why we have GraphQL to begin with. And so that story starts in 2011. So Facebook, there was a team of folks at Facebook, some names you might know, Lee Byron, Dan Schaefer, Nick Schrock. Lee is pretty well known. He is one of the core GraphQL people. He's also one of the people behind Immutable.js. And so let's all imagine that we're the Facebook team, we're this iOS newsfeed team at Facebook, which is a nice thought because Facebook engineers, we're all fabulously wealthy and really accomplished, and this is what I imagine Facebook engineers do all day. It's 24/7, 365. By the way, before I keep going, my rule of Tech Talks is always give people code early because that's really why you're here. So here's some code. So we've got some really brilliant people at Facebook, right? Some really accomplished engineers. But like all software people, they are faced with technical problems on a daily basis that make them question their purpose in life, gives them great existential angst, makes them not sleep at night like the rest of us. And they had one very specific problem. And that problem was Facebook's traditional Facebook was written in PHP. Much of it still is, although they've migrated a number of things to React. And so Facebook had this very traditional web architecture where you had you make a request to a web server, and the web server gets some data, and then it sends back some HTML and CSS and JavaScript and front-end assets, images, GIFs, or is it GIFs? GIFs. I shouldn't start that debate, right? Then we're getting into like semicolons versus no semicolons. Semicolons, exactly. What are we, savages? End the damn line, people. Or tabs versus spaces. Tabs, obviously. Thank you, Joe. So Facebook has this architecture where they're just serving HTML, and previously their mobile experience was essentially just delivering a wrapped browser where you keep the same architecture, so just delivers HTML, and that had worked really well for them. Facebook, even in 2011, right, still had a really rich user experience. And the problem is now they wanted to change the iOS app, the newsfeed specifically on iOS, to be a native app, right? So it's not just a browser, it's an actual app that installs on your phone. And the problem, though, is how do you do that when your servers are just sending down front-end assets? And so Facebook at this point had a really rich sort of data architecture. So they had, obviously you can imagine a substantial amount of data storage, but they also had REST services, and they had something called FQL. Did anybody use FQL, Joe? Of course. FQL was Facebook query language. It was a publicly accessible API up until 2016. They sunset it in 2016. And it looks like SQL, right? Anybody done SQL? It was a of course, yeah. Same here. I saw another hand there. I'm sorry. I'm sorry that we all had. Let's get together and mourn the fact that we actually had to do SQL to begin with. So they had FQL, which was the SQL-like language, and so they decided to start with that, right? So we've got a mobile UI, we've got to get data. FQL's already there. Let's use that. And often one of the problems that you encounter when you do SQL, those of us who've done SQL, is you start out with this very naive idea that we're going to have tables and we'll normalize our database so that we have this table and there's keys here and keys in this table and they link, and anytime we need to get that data we can do some joins and maybe some views and get that data back. Very naive, right? Because 5 years down the line you've got like this mess of joins and views, and we could have stored procedures because all of our joins are all messed up, and then we've got triggers and all this crazy junk. And so they went with FQL and ended up having a lot of bugs because they had all these crazy joins that were causing problems for them. So that didn't work. So then they said, okay, let's look at our REST architecture, because we've got a ton of REST services. And REST is great. Does everybody know what REST is? Everybody's pretty comfortable with REST. If I say REST, we're not glazing over. I won't get in.
Soap, right?
Exactly like soap. Oh God. Soap is another thing. Let it like die in the graveyard of terrible technologies. Querying XML, that's a good time.
It had its moments.
Well, it was the best at the time, right? We're always doing our best with what we have. So they obviously had a lot of REST services at Facebook. But what are the problems with REST? Right, so there are a number of really key problems with REST. One is that the creator of REST is a crazy person who yells at you from his lawn that you're not doing REST correctly. That's only a problem if you pay attention to him. But there's a couple of real significant issues. One is that you often make a REST request, right? And then you get data back. And then within the data of that REST request, you might have to make more sort of subsequent network requests. And you end up with this sort of chain of network requests. And that can be maybe not super performant and a lot of times not very efficient. And maybe even the bigger issue is when you make a request to a REST endpoint, you get back whatever that endpoint serves you based on whatever parameters you give it. So I may have to, like in the jQuery days, right? Anybody who did jQuery, one of the things it really had that was awesome was it abstracted XHR away from you. And because anybody who likes doing raw XHR is a psychopath and you should run from them. So if you meet someone like that, there's something very wrong with that person. And jQuery would have like, you do your jQuery.get and you hit your endpoint and it would come back, and in your success callback, you'd get like this data thing, and then you'd map over the data, and you'd sort of have to map it to the data that your front-end view or model was expecting. And that's not always bad if you're making a few API calls, but this is Facebook, right? This is like the biggest app on the planet. And so if you're making 10, 12, I don't know how many requests they were making, but any significant amount of requests, now every time you make a request, you've got to get data and massage that data into your model, right? So that's not ideal. So one of the other things then people do is they say, well, okay, I've got an idea. We'll come with custom endpoints. We'll just make custom endpoints for our UI. And boom, there you go. And then anytime we've got a change, no problem. But the problem is, then every time you make that change, if I make a change to the UI, now I've got to make a change to the server. And so you end up with this really inefficient situation where you've got to keep both in sync. So that's also not ideal. And remember, again, every time, that's for each REST endpoint, right? So for each custom endpoint, we have to go make changes. For a small app, maybe not a huge deal, but again, this is Facebook. Who knows how many requests they're making? They're making a lot of requests. That gets pretty unwieldy pretty quickly. So to solve this problem, so again, I'm pretending we're all Facebook engineers. To solve this problem, we come up with a solution where we only make one round trip to the server, and we get the data in the exact shape and format that we're expecting. And not only that, we just bolt it on to our existing architecture. So we're not rewriting services, we're not changing any of our data layer, we're not doing any of that stuff. They've actually described it as a thin layer or sort of a wrapper on top of your business logic. Huge advantage. It's sort of like, I like to think of it like, if there's any car people in here, like a supercharger versus a turbocharger, right? One of the advantages of a supercharger versus a turbocharger is turbo, you have to like redo the exhaust, and you've got all this re-architecting to do. And a supercharger, there literally are called bolt-on superchargers. You just kind of bolt it on there. You don't have to redo some of your engine bay. So it's sort of a really convenient thing to do, to be able to just throw it on top of your existing architecture. This is also called sometimes an API gateway pattern. This is not a new pattern. This isn't new to this isn't like unique to GraphQL. This is a situation where I've got a single point that I'm going to hit for hitting maybe all of my services. I would say though that GraphQL is probably the best implementation of this pattern, at least the best to this date. So anybody watching this 5 years, I'm sure you have something much cooler.
Todd says GraphQL is the best.
Yeah, Todd says GraphQL is the best for eternity. Nothing will ever eclipse it. And so lastly, there have been some other standards and technologies that have attempted to solve some similar problems that GraphQL solves, but they've fallen a little short. So one is called OData. I've actually worked on a project that used OData services. As you can see, you end up with ever more complicated query strings. I don't know how that's better.
Just SQL and a URL.
Yeah, exactly. It's SQL and a URL.
Better than nothing.
SQL, like, I suppose better than nothing. But is it though? Because having to unlearn crap is like mental overhead. There's too much to learn anyway. So OData wasn't great. OData may have been okay. In some ways, in a raw sense, this is not totally dissimilar to what GraphQL is actually doing, but what GraphQL gives you is a really, really powerful interface. So lastly, a timeline before we get to creating our GraphQL server. It's like the T's, right? So February of 2012, Nick Schrock does a POC over, I think they said a few days, comes up with something called Supergraph. In August of 2012, Facebook puts GraphQL into production to serve the iOS newsfeed. And in July of 2015, they open source GraphQL. I say this partly because if you go to your manager tomorrow and say, hey, I saw this really awesome GraphQL presentation by this handsome and charming guy, why are you laughing? Yeah, of course you're laughing because it was like this annoying guy who wouldn't shut up. And you say, hey, this GraphQL thing looks really cool. I think this could really help us. And your manager's like, hey, I don't know, this is new, and we don't want to jump at every new technology. Remind them, this has been around for 6 years. And 6 years at Facebook, basically being stress tested at the highest level, because wherever any of us work, we're not working at Facebook. We don't have the requests and demands. I think at one point, Lee Byron said, and this was in 2015, they were serving like 260 billion requests a day. That's billion with a B. So anybody who says, well, I don't know if GraphQL is mature enough, I think it's probably pretty mature. So here's what we're gonna do. So now, I didn't want to live code this, partly because I knew I'd get flustered, but also because about like half hour of the hour would just be me correcting my typos, and that's no fun. So what's that?
We play a video. No, we all watch your video.
Yeah, exactly. So here's a video. Yeah, I should have taken like a screencast and then just, that actually would be an interesting idea. So what I'm going to do is kind of copy and paste stuff and walk through it. So this is a JavaScript meetup, right? So we're going to do this in JavaScript. I should mention beforehand that there are implementations of GraphQL. GraphQL, they say, is really a specification more than a specific technology. There are implementations in Java and Groovy and Ruby and Erlang. So there are tons of different specifications for JavaScript. And I'm going to be showing you, I guess I'll show you this now. When you go on the, are we actually recording, or should I start over?
Yes, start over.
Everybody's like, no. So often what you will see, let's go here. These are all the libraries. One of the really, I guess I get this out of the way first. One of the real points of confusion is that you will go on the GraphQL site and they'll give you all of these examples of GraphQL types and queries and everything. And they'll be in this like really nice, really understandable format. But there's no, like your IDE doesn't have a GraphQL extension that's going to take GraphQL and then lex it and parse it and spit it out in a format that you need. So every language has its own specification. And this is from the GraphQL JS package. Now I'll get to things like Apollo and some other things just very briefly at the end as alternatives. But this is from the GraphQL JS package, and I didn't want to do this because there's like tons of boilerplate and tons of extra syntax that we would have to go over. Okay, so the stuff I'll be showing you isn't necessarily what I would recommend you do if you're going to put it in production, but it was the way that I thought was most amenable to learning it. So I've got a Node and Express app here. This is using the Express GraphQL package. So one thing, this is a super simple server. I'm running on 48,000, nothing complicated here. The thing to notice is that we've got one Express route here. So this one route, whereas opposed to, let me pull up my rest. I actually have some microservices, some very rudimentary microservices running that this will be using. And this is like a typical Express where we've got different routes that we're routing to. In GraphQL, in Express GraphQL, we're only using one route, so it's the /GraphQL route. And there are a number of parameters that this Express GraphQL function takes. You see it takes a config object, and there's usually 2 or 3 you'll see. There's another one I'll get to in a second here. There's a schema. Schema is kind of the heart of GraphQL. There's this thing called graphical, which we'll talk about. Graphical is honestly one of the most brilliant things they did for GraphQL. It's a really powerful UI for creating queries, and you use it, if you're a GraphQL developer, you use it pretty much every time you interface with GraphQL. And then there's this root value resolvers thing, which is super important. And we'll get to resolvers. Right now, let's not be too worried about those things. There's also one other, and I love VS Code, by the way. Anyone from the VS Code team ever sees me somewhere, I want to thank you personally. I love VS Code. It's great IDE. I came from Visual Studio, which was a behemoth and a pain to use. I feel like VS Code gives you all the good stuff of that without all the heft. So we're getting IntelliSense here, and there's this context parameter. So in the GraphQL spec, there's nothing about authentication or caching. I have a quote from Lee Byron about that. They never intended for it to do any of that stuff. And he said people will sometimes ask him, how do we do caching or authentication? And their answer is usually, well, you don't. But one thing you can do, so maybe you have a caching function that you want to write, and in all of your resolvers, you want to use that caching function. So if you don't know what I'm talking about yet, if you don't know GraphQL, don't worry about it. I'm just laying some of these things out before we move on to the heart. This context thing, like in React, right? React has context. Redux takes advantage of context to make its store state globally available. Context makes any functions that you want globally available in GraphQL globally available. All right, and I am also using the excellent Kent C. Dodd's NPS package, which basically just allows you, instead of having to write NPM scripts, you write objects, because we're all used to writing objects, so you can actually write code instead of just strings. And it gives you some sort of powerful things. So, oh my gosh, it crashed. That's the end of the presentation. Thank you, everybody. So it crashed because we're giving it a schema that doesn't exist. We're giving it resolvers that don't exist. So the first thing we're going to need, and I have a GitHub for this. So the example app I'm going to be showing you is a Reddit-like, very, very rudimentary, very simple, basic implementation of what we might do if we're doing a Reddit-like app. That is, it's definitely not Reddit. And so there's going to be posts and comments, and the comments will be related to those posts. And if we kept going, we'd have comments that are parents of other comments, and we might have a voting system, but we're not going to do that. So the first thing, sort of the basic thing you need in GraphQL is a type. And so let's start with a post. So what I'm going to do is I'll copy this, and then I'll kind of just quickly run through them. Right, and I'm not transpiling it, so we're doing CommonJS imports and exports, not using Babel. And so here we've got our first type. So the first things to take a look at, what does this look like? It looks like a JavaScript object. Notice this is all an ES6 template literal. So when I was telling you at the start that we're not going to be doing the JavaScript implementation, we're going to be doing this sort of different, more query language looking way, because I think it's a little bit easier to grok. There are some other negatives to doing it this way, which is why I don't recommend, if you're going to do GraphQL in production, that you don't use this. You don't get IntelliSense, and you don't get ESLint. You're just passing it a string. And the problem is, if I make some typos in my string, I don't know until I fire up my server. So it's one of the main reasons I don't recommend this. So here's our type, post type. It looks like an object that's got properties. Those properties have these strange things next to them. So every custom type you create has to have fields, and those fields are going to basically map to the data that comes into GraphQL. And those fields are going to be of a certain type. So, and they're like the common scalar values that we're used to in programming. So there's integers, there's strings, there's booleans, and then pay attention here. There's something a little odd there. So what looks like an array in GraphQL parlance, it's actually a list, but same difference really. And so that's returning what's going to be a list of one of our types. So it's kind of neat that within a type you can return other types. And notice this comments field, it kind of looks like a function, right? And then anybody who's done, you'll see a lot more of this, but anybody who's done like Flow or TypeScript, you see it's like there's a colon specifying what the return type is. So that's our post type. Very exciting. Oh, let me explain the
exclamation point.
Yes. I was just about to remember that I forgot that. So the exclamation points specify that. So when you get data into your type, you may get some data that only has some of these types. So maybe I get some data back and there's no votes and there's no comments. And that means they've come in there as null. And so when you add an exclamation point, you're saying that these particular types are non-null, or another, conversely, they are nullable. So we're going to allow them to be null. So the other thing to point out, and those actually come from the what I'm going to talk about, this implements keyword. Those are specified in the interface. So anytime you see an implements keyword in computer science, maybe I shouldn't paint with that broad of a brush, but that generally means we're going to be doing something with either an abstract type or more specifically an interface. So if you haven't worked with interfaces, languages like Java, C#, I'm sure many other languages. What's that?
TypeScript.
TypeScript, yes, thank you. TypeScript has interfaces. And they have some weird implementation for interfaces where you don't always have to do a concrete type, which I always found interesting. Yeah, so an interface in some of those languages, like in a C# interface, I'll talk about C# interfaces because that's what I know. And C# was basically Anders Heilsberg taking Java, making some changes, and calling it C#. And so it has interfaces. So interfaces in the OOP world are a way that you can specify certain methods that are going to be on your class. And so when you create a class that implements that interface, it has to have those things. And if you have never used interfaces, or maybe you never will, the reason it's kind of cool is you can end up doing things with what's called interface-based polymorphism, or sometimes referred more loosely as dependency injection, where I may be calling a function on the interface, and at runtime I'm going to pass in something that implements that interface that's going to call that function. GraphQL interfaces are a bit simpler than that. They're really just there they're usable. I don't think we'll have time to get into it, but they're usable in queries if we want to do more polymorphic queries. If in a query we want to say, if it's of a certain type, give me this. They have these things called online fragments. It'll be like on, post, give me this field. If you get something that's a comment, give me this field. And so it gives you a little bit of polymorphism there. But fundamentally, it's really just there so that if you want types that adhere, a lot of times they talk about them in the OOP world as like a contract. So if we're on a team, I may write an interface and say, hey, if we make any types off of this, you need to make sure that it implements this interface because we want every type to implement that interface. That's, I guess, probably the other use case for it. Let me grab the comment type. And this. And I'll save it, and you'll notice it'll still fail because we don't have everything we need. So this is a comment type. So now it should look a little bit more familiar. We've got this implements. We've got these nullable fields, and then there's some weird kind of comments in there. I shouldn't have used comment and also have comments. But these are basically descriptions. So when you fire up GraphQL or graphical and you're creating queries, sometimes these descriptions will give you more descriptive information about the field or the type that you're trying to query. And none of that's going to run because we haven't put in our interfaces yet. Well, just one interface. Very, very exciting. So here's that. And I guess what I'll point out sort of briefly here is these are all non-null, right? So anything that implements that interface has to have these fields, and they have to also be non-null. And notice that votes is nullable. So if we look back at our types, all of those are, all these three, title is in the interface because it's only specific to post. But those three fields are non-null, just like the interface specifies. So, okay, now we've got our interfaces, we've got all of that stuff. So now we get into what really kind of makes all of this go. GraphQL has a schema. So I guess I would say it flows like this. We've got a schema, and then there are certain operations you can run within that schema, and then those operations have different types, and there are 2 main operations, 3 total. So there are queries, which are the most common thing since it's a query language. We have mutations, which are for when you are updating data, just like Mike last month, if you were here, gave a talk on functional programming. Functional programming is really hot in the JavaScript world right now, and functional often talks about mutability, immutability. So this idea of mutation, I think, is sort of borrowed from that idea of mutability, where mutating means updating or adding data. So we're going to have these base types of a query and a mutation. I don't know if I mentioned the third one. Third one is a subscription. It's sort of the creepy uncle that you keep in the basement that you don't want anyone to know lives there. I've never actually seen a subscription in the wild. I guess I'm the only one who has that person in my family.
You're the only one who talks about it.
Or the only one willing to talk about it. The rest of you are living, you sit on a throne of lies. So I hope no one on the GraphQL team ever sees this and knows that I describe subscriptions this way. But I don't know if I've ever actually seen a subscription. Subscriptions are in sort of a pub sub model, sort of a push model. So if you create a subscription, it's sort of there to, when an event happens, push out data to you. I've never used a subscription, and I've seen very few, although I think Apollo has some
I mean, if it exists, they probably cover it. They'd get yelled at
Yeah.
if they didn't.
I actually looked up subscription. I Googled subscription because I think Dan Schaefer mentioned it in one of his talks. And I found like a blog post that Facebook did in 2015 talking about subscriptions. So I was like, oh, that's kind of what you need to know about subscriptions.
Hey Todd,
Yeah.
real quick, just so I'm up to speed. You had 2 types, post and comments, and post and comment, and post had a comments field that was representative of a list of comments.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes. You said it much more succinctly than I did. So here is our query type. And notice I'm pulling in the interface and the types that we created, and then I'm basically concatenating them all as one string. Essentially what's going to happen is I'm going to give GraphQL a big string and concatenate this all together, and then it lexes and parses. And in the GraphQL JS package, if you noticed, here we're calling GraphQL build schema. There's actually a build AST schema, so if anybody's done anything with abstract syntax trees, any kind of Babel work, basically they're going to take this string and they're going to lex it and parse it and turn it into an AST, and then I think pretty much they output it as stuff like this, where you've got GraphQL object types. There is, so I was talking about how those are null. The things with the fields with the exclamation point are non-null. There is specifically a GraphQL non-null. All of those things end up essentially getting compiled and output as those objects and types. So let's just talk quickly about the query. So this is our query type. So these, again, I don't want to belabor the point, but these queries and mutations are sort of made up of all of these custom types that you create. So we've got our query type, and we've got a post and posts and comment and comments, and those kind of look like functions, right? They kind of look like function signatures, kind of a function call, except we've got the types in there. And notice that these are sending back. They have a return value of the types that we just created, the custom types we just created, right? And yeah, I guess that's all I want to say about that. Let's move on. I know this is going to take way longer than I expected. And so now let's get a mutation in here. This is going to throw another little wrench here. And notice we're still crashing down. Oh no, we're running now because our schema is kind of as complete as it can be. So now we've got some stuff in here. So we've got the mutation type, right? I said there was going to be the query and the mutation type. We've got the mutation type. It's made up of a create post and a create comment. And now we've, again, there's return values. Our create post is going to return a post, and our create comment is going to return a comment. And notice we've got this thing now, these inputs. And so we've got a post input and a comment input that kind of looks something like the query types that we had. And so let me save you a lot of time. So I've had times working in GraphQL where I was like, okay, I'm going to create a mutation and it's going to take a comment. And then GraphQL barks at me and says, you can't do that. You have to send in an input type when you're doing that. And then I scratch my head and I search Google and I realize that for the 5th time I've forgotten that I have to do an input type when I'm doing a mutation. So that's specifically what it's going to be. So we're going to, when you send in a mutation, you're going to have to send in basically an object that's going to be called a post that's going to have to conform to the post input. Although notice that some of those are nullable. The thing I want to say about that, one of the ways that sort of helped me think about GraphQL. So you've got query types, right? And the purpose of a query type is to take the data that's underneath it, whether it's coming from a microservice or a bunch of microservices, or directly calling a database, or going to S3, or whatever it's doing. It's taking data, it's mapping it to whatever types you have, and then it's spitting it back to you. In the same way, a mutation is taking data from you, it's mapping it to a type, and then it's doing whatever it needs to do under the covers. So I found that to be a helpful way to think about this. And so, and now let's go to our, did I have it up already? Let's go to our GraphQL server. I should have that right. And, oh, nothing's coming up. And the reason nothing's coming up is because it's running and it's supposed to pull up this graphical thing, and I have it set as false. So let's set that as true. And here we go. And so this is graphical. This is what I said is, it's probably the thing that would have made OData useful if they had been smart enough to come up with something like this. A lot of shots at OData today. Microsoft, although I did give them VS Code love. So this is graphical, right? There's going to be a number of things we're going to want to pay attention to here. We've got some commented out stuff here that's meant to give you some places to start. And get rid of my query variable here.
Microsoft fan just stormed out.
Yeah, very offended. I could tell he was offended. He gave me a glare when I said that about OData. So GraphQL is going to be kind of our playground for generating queries and mutations and those sorts of things. So a couple of things I want to point out at first is over on the right here, there's this docs thing. And that is really, really useful. Another kind of little stroke of brilliance. So all of the type information that you give GraphQL, all of those descriptions that are in there, and the descriptions in the GraphQL JS library work really well here. They don't work, unfortunately, quite as well as they are. They don't work quite as well in the solution that I'm showing you. And so in here, so here's our query type. And we just looked at this, right? So we've got a post, and that returns post. That's very informative. And these are returning, taking those sorts of things. And we've got our mutation. We've got our create, right? So that's all we just showed. So that's nice, right? Because let's say you're a front-end developer, and all you do is interface with this. You're not going in there, you're not creating types, you're not creating resolvers. This might be really helpful, although, to be honest, you use more of the at least for me, I use more of the IntelliSense in GraphQL than I do checking the docs. It's kind of nice to know they're there if you need them. So that's one thing. This Prettify history. History is kind of nice. I actually didn't know about this until I was doing this setting up this presentation. This kind of has a little bit of a cache of your recent queries that you've run.
Is that new?
It might be. I don't know. Or maybe I was just completely oblivious to it. There have been other things that have been a little oblivious to, so I just chalk it up to my ignorance. I chalk up everything to my ignorance. So let's do our first query. This is going to be super exciting. So brackets looks like an object, right? It's like a JavaScript object. And one of the best things about graphical is if you do control space, ta-da! Here's everything that, here's all of our queries. Notice it's not showing our mutations though. So let's go in here and let's say I want to get a post. And what do I want to get? And you could just type a letter, by the way, and it'll come up with something, anything that has that letter in it. So let's say I do want my ID, and I want the title, and I want the author, and I want how many votes it has. And notice it's giving us the scalar value too. It's telling us it's an int, and I believe also go to ID. I don't know. It's not showing. I was hoping it would show whether it was nullable or not. And so, super exciting. First GraphQL query. We're all GraphQL developers now. Oh no, we've got null. We've got no data. Why don't we have any data? Well, the reason we don't have any data is we have types in GraphQL. We haven't done anything that maps the data we're getting from GraphQL. Actually, to be more accurate, we haven't made a call anywhere to get data. So to do that, remember in the beginning I talked about this root value resolvers thing? So this root value, I don't know why they call it root value. I wish they had just called it resolvers. But GraphQL has this concept of resolvers, and it literally means that you're going to resolve the data that you get to whatever type you're expecting it to be. So let's go. So we've got nothing here, right? Let me go back to my GitHub. And this is actually the first JavaScript in 45 minutes at a JavaScript meetup. This is the first JavaScript we're looking at. And oh man, so much scrolling with so don't worry about that. So I'm using fetch, using isomorphic fetch because we're in Node Express right now. Huge fan of fetch, huge fan of async await. Maybe that's part of my C#. C# had async await actually a bit before JavaScript did. If you're not using async await, I highly recommend async await. Very cool.
Have you ever seen what it transpiles to?
I don't want to know what it transpiles to. But it's native in Node.
Well, yeah, Node's probably doing the same thing anyways, but yeah.
Probably.
But if you're transpiling to ES5, making heavy use of async await is, you should check out your JavaScript.
It's just a speed loop, right? It just sits in a speed loop.
It's ginormous.
Is it really?
Yeah.
Yeah. Any of that transpiled stuff, though.
Not like the.
Not like this, really. But like basic TypeScript. If you ever look at basic TypeScript, it's like, oh my God, why are you doing this? So one of the things I'll point out, and we don't really have time to get into the implementation details here, but all of these functions, and these are using ES6 arrow functions, except for my little function down here that's a helper. We're doing a number of things here, but I guess the first thing I'll point out is that all of these resolvers are named the same as the query type and the mutations, right? So, and this is the tricky thing. You don't have to do this as much. There's some sort of help they give you in the GraphQL JS package when you actually start doing it in JavaScript that you can get a little bit fancier and you don't have to have this. I found this out the hard way because I was creating resolvers and I was like, why is it not like resolving my data? It was because these functions had to literally be the exact same name as what was specified in the query and the mutation. Also, very important, the parameters there on the site, they actually have a resolvers spec, but in GraphQL, what a resolver gets is something called an args object. And so if I didn't have the brackets here, I'm just doing parameter destructuring. If I didn't have the brackets here, then I would get some problems because it's just feeding it the raw args objects. I'm just destructuring those out of the args object. I could have done like args, and then down here I could have done args.post. And so now that we've got those, and if you have questions, please throw them after, but like bookmark them. If there's something super urgent, throw it my way. Now that we have resolvers, oh hey, we're getting an error, yay. Oh, and I know why, because this is expecting something. And yay, we're getting data. And our votes is null because we said votes was a nullable field. And so fantastic, now we're getting data back. So that's our first query. And go here, talk about that. The next thing that's really
that data being sourced from those microservices you were talking about earlier?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So those are running, have those up here. So here's our comments microservice. Here's our posts microservice. That was one. That was this one. And I think I mentioned earlier, you could you could have some files. There's like the MS SQL package or SQLize, any of the Mongoose, any of the ORMs that you could use in a JavaScript project to point to a database. You could use that in your resolvers. So you could have GraphQL directly talking to your database. I mean, with an ORM in between, but you don't have to do microservices. It's just often recommended these days. You've got to go with the buzzwords. Got to make the CIOs happy. Yes, yeah, Hadoop and Spark and all that stuff. A really important thing about GraphQL is, in one of his talks, Lee Byron said that you want to be really careful when you set up your types and endpoints, because generally you're not going to be going back and changing them very often. So you're often kind of stuck with them for a while. And so there's one way of getting around that, right? So let's say our needs change, and what once was votes is going to be something else. So we will call it, let's say we have, and this is Reddit, right? So there's often odd Reddit parlance. So we're going to change it. Oops. Again, why you should be very glad I'm not live coding this. Let's change it to updates. I just heard that on Reddit somewhere. So our UI now has changed, and we called it updates instead of votes. And so instead of having to go and change something on the server, right? I remember I was talking about custom endpoints. The problem is anytime you change it on the front end, you got to change it on the back end. The GraphQL has what's called aliases. So I can alias this as whatever I want, and when I get it back,
You did it on the wrong line, right?
what's
You
that?
wanted to rename.
Oh yeah, I did, didn't I? I got all flustered. Thank you, Joe. There we go, for clarity. Right, so now, instead of being called votes, it's called updates. So I haven't had a need to do a lot of aliasing, but it's kind of nice to know it's there. So now let's say we also want to get comments, right? And we've got comments, and those require a post ID. And we want to get all the comments for post 1. And now we have an ID. We don't need the post ID because we're specifying it. The body of the comment, we want the author, votes. And, but we've got a problem now. We've got 2 anonymous operations. So in GraphQL, each of these, I mean, we kind of talk about them as queries, but they're basically actually called operations in GraphQL. So what we can do is, let's say I've got, you have to specify what type it is. Right? I think I showed you with that anonymous object, the anonymous operation. It was only showing queries. It wasn't showing mutations. I don't know if you remember that. That's because for mutation, you actually have to specify that you're going to be doing a mutation. So we've got a query, and we'll say get post. And for comments, we'll say, we'll get a query, let's get comments. And this is actually a feature, one of my coworkers, really good developer, but I was working in GraphQL one day, and he's like, and he'd been working in GraphQL for a year and a half maybe, and he didn't know this feature existed. So now that I've got operation names on my queries, in this play button, I can actually choose to run individual queries. Right, so there we go. And I'm getting all the comments here. And as we go, these operation names are really important because when you do variables and some of the other things, you have to have an operation name. Also, well, I'll get there. One thing I want to point out as I was talking about graphical, before I forget, so often, let's say you are the person responsible for creating GraphQL stuff, right? And we want to push out, we want to deploy a new version of our GraphQL server. And our QA people need to test it, but how are they going to test it? So sometimes what you could do is like copy the queries and say, hey, go here and then copy this in. But what's even cooler is if I just copy the URL and go to a different browser, paste that in, now my queries are there. And so I can just Slack someone that URL, and sometimes you'll end up with like a lot of operations, and they might be parameterized, and you don't want to have to copy and paste that stuff. And all of those will be there. Sometimes your DevOps people, if you're in an organization where they don't want developers touching production because they're right, and developers shouldn't be touching production, because only suffering comes from us touching production. I don't ever want to touch production. We've had times where we've just sent out a bunch of mutations in a URL to our DevOps people, and then they make a bunch of changes. So also one of the super cool things about graphical is you can do that. Next, let's talk about variables. So this is all nice and good, but if we end up with like a bunch of different operations, and maybe I'll do a mutation, right? So I've got a mutation and call it add comment. And so here's our create comment mutation, and remember it took this comment input. Right? So here's a comment, and I'm giving it an object, and control space, and it tells me what I need to supply, and we'll say you suck as a presenter. And a lot of self-loathing in this present. All my presentations are filled with self-loathing. This time I'm just making it explicit.
Feels more like Reddit that way.
Exactly. It's very Reddit-like. Just keeping with the theme. Well played. And you know it's self-loathing because I'm the one making the comment, and that's going in the database forever. And we want this for post ID 1. And so also I showed you in the mutation, right? Let's look in the docs. So I don't have to go to types. Or go to the it returns the comment, right? So this mutation has a return value. And let's specify what we're going to get back. So let's say, I don't know, let's say we only care about body and the author. And we'll add that comment. And it returned the body and the author, added that. And now let's get all the comments for post 1. Comments, and it added that. And so let's say though, I mean, I've had times where we were doing like a bunch of mutations for like 10 different, for us it's affiliates at Legacy, for like a whole bunch of affiliates, and to have to go through to each mutation and change things is kind of a pain. And remember I said a lot of this stuff ends up kind of looking like functions and looking like JavaScript after a while. So in GraphQL does exist are, let's call this post, are variables. And so one of the other things that's really important about having an operation name is it's required if you're going to use a variable. And we have to specify it to the type, to the type that field has to abide by. So it's a non-null int. And then in our comments here, we'll say $post. And then we'll just do the same here. Do the same here. Post. Post. And that will work because I haven't specified a variable yet. So down here, there's this variable section. Let me pull this up in case you can't really see it. So down here, I can specify the variable, and it's going to be more of a JSON format. So your property name is going to be a string, and but this can be just like a JSON. And now, all of these are just working off of the variable. So that's something that's really helpful. Also, kind of cool. I don't know if this will work. But I believe let's see, here I could add a default value. Maybe it's not there. Let's put that operation name too. So in this get comments, if I give it maybe I don't know, the wrong value. Let's see if this works. Yeah, variable post of type int is required when we use the default value. You're just going to have to take my word on that. That works. I honestly have not found much of a use case for that, but it's kind of neat that it's there.
So the $sign is just the naming convention of the variable?
Yeah.
Like no matter what you name it? Is there other weirdness?
I don't think so. One of the weirdness...
Spaces? Symbols?
I think it... that's a good question. Sorry. If we put like a dash... Oh. Well, the reason... So one thing, this can be really frustrating. This is another thing I just only recently figured out. I don't know, for me, the way my brain works, if I'm creating a variable, I go to the variables section and create a variable. But the problem is, it's creating the variable, it's going based on what it finds in the operations. So if I try to add like a comments variable, it just immediately starts creating a post variable, even though I already have one, right? So I could get rid of that and say something, and it's still just creates it. So what you have to do, and this just was counterintuitive for me, is actually create the variable in your operation, and then it's fine down here. But it's just a...
It's pretty aggressive.
Isn't it? Right? It's like, no, you're not doing that. It's got to be a post. There's, very briefly, let's talk about something called a directive. If anybody did Angular 1, the term directive should make you shudder. The directive API was just horrendous. One of the reasons why React is better. One of the many.
Components now?
What's that?
We call it components now?
Turtles, components all the way down.
I guess, but the API for it was so strange with like symbols that might do something in one scenario and not in another. So the, GraphQL has a directive also, and it's pretty simple. It's basically a Boolean, and this is something that might be useful if, let's say, I don't know,
You're gonna need to give us an example.
right? That exactly. No, so I'm thinking, Joe. It happens sometimes. So let's say on my front end, right? Because ultimately this is all nice in graphical, but it's not really useful unless I can, from my React components maybe or wherever, I'm sending stuff to GraphQL so I can get it back. So in there, this is probably going to be like a template literal, and I'm probably going to, I actually can show you this, because I have a couple examples. It's template literal, and I might be interpolating whatever variable. So like in the app, I may call something and interpolate the ID in, and then say, well, if they've, I don't know, this isn't what would happen on Reddit, but if they've already seen it, we won't show it. And so we might have like a variable in here that says seen, or seen, and maybe it's a certain color, or whatever, I don't know. The link is a certain color. We would pass that into this includes. So it takes an if, and let's say false. And that's like, it's like a truthy check, right? So it's saying, if this is true, do this, but false is not true, so it shouldn't include author. It's include, not includes. And there you go, and now it's not including author, but if I make this true, it includes it. Super exciting. The last thing I'll talk about with regard to queries and mutations is something called a fragment, which I've actually recently come to believe is pretty useful. So what I can do is say fragment standard comment field. Sorry, it's got to be standard comment fields, and the fragment is going to be on a certain type. It's going to be on a comment, but it could be on the interface if you notice. So we could say let's not do that. We could do it on interface. And in here we're going to specify fields. So we always want the ID and the post ID. Or we could just copy these and throw them in there. And let's get the post ID. And is there anything we're missing? I don't think so. What's kind of cool about this is, right, so now instead of, it gets really tedious to like keep like, let me IntelliSense to see what's open on this type. Instead, we can do that sort of once or a few times, and I'll leave this directive in there just to show you it'll still work. And we'll take the fragment, we'll say standard comment fields, and I think it won't work on the mutation because, yeah, it's not going to work on the mutation. And we'll run this get comments, and it should pull all these. And what does this look like? Anybody say? It's like object spread, right? We use object spread, which is one of my favorite. Well, technically, object spread is, I think it's coming in ES 2018. It's been usable because of Babel. We have had REST parameters and array spreads, basically. But that looks very much like what we're used to with JavaScript. And again, this is one of those examples where the GraphQL team is using stuff that's standard convention in certain languages. I don't think we have time to get into inline fragments. Inline fragments, I mentioned at the top, there's interfaces, right? And we can sort of do these sort of polymorphic queries. Inline fragments are the way that you do that. You say ... space on, and then comment, and whatever my unique comment fields are, get that. And so you're essentially saying, I know I said this earlier, but just to hammer it home, I guess, that when you run the query, if it finds something that conforms to that, it'll give it to you. So we talked about mutations. I talked about input types. One other thing you can do if you have a REST client, maybe you don't want to use GraphQL for whatever reason. I believe Postman also supports GraphQL queries. Insomnia is my favorite REST client. I used to use Postman, and then Insomnia is just awesome. It actually has a GraphQL query tab. I have the same ringtone that's freaking me out. But I can just, and the other cool thing is I can say query, and my query, when I go in here, my operation, I can also do control space, and it's giving me the things that I would get in graphical. So that's also really cool. And then I could actually just get rid of this. And these, by the way, I don't have time to get into these, but these are part of an introspection system, so you can send that __ schema, and it'll send you back the schema. So it's basically GraphQL is using itself to tell you what's there. It's pretty neat.
Hey Todd, not to derail, but I'm super curious about Insomnia. Is that a standalone app? Is it a desktop app?
Yeah.
Is it available on Mac as well? Do you know?
Yes, I use it all the time. My work laptop is a Mac, and I use it all the time. It's really great. I love the basic theme. I really like the. I mean, you can do it in Postman too, but the way you can sort of group your API calls together is really nice. Yeah, and so if I run this, let me just make sure this is right. This would be my AMA for this, and it comes back. It shows you all this information. So that's how you would do it from that. Let me show you, I think I was just talking about, so this was originally going to be my presentation, then I ditched it because I got interested in the Reddit idea. But this is actually a service that some React components are using. And so to me, this is the more interesting one. I was saying, like, you'd have an ES6 template literal, and you might interpolate something. So this is a function that's going to run. I'm going to pass in this ID. It's going to interpolate that, give it back to me, and then in my fetch, I'd actually include that in the fetch. Let me show you. I think I have that here in the service. Right. So queries.project ID. We get that query back as a string. We call fetch using that as the body, and then it returns our data. And that's kind of how you do it. I'm also a huge fan of the fetch API. And that isomorphic fetch I'm using on the server side is also really helpful on the front end, because not all browsers support fetch, mostly the old browsers at this point. So some other things. So there's like really the fundamentals of GraphQL. I mentioned there are implementations in other languages. You may have heard something called Relay. Joe and I were talking about Relay before I started. Relay was also a solution that the GraphQL team came up with, mostly for front end, right, Joe? Yeah, it was mostly for use on the front end. It kind of had a bunch of buzz, and then it's kind of quickly died off. You'll still hear about it.
I don't know if it's, well,
Not died off.
really modern.
Yeah, that's true.
It's super ambitious is the problem. It doesn't just do like, hey, we can connect you to GraphQL. It does a lot. That's a whole other talk for someone else to do.
Right. Maybe next month someone could do a Relay talk.
I doubt it, but nobody knows enough about it.
So Relay, I've never really gotten into Relay. I looked into it, and it just, I don't know, it seemed like too much. Apollo has sort of replaced it, at least in buzz. Apollo is really, really popular. If you were here for Joe's talk, what was it? In the fall. The React talk that Joe did with the really cool VR Star Wars thing. He was using Apollo in that. Apollo is very popular. Although there was a bit of a spat between the GraphQL team and the Apollo team. Did you see any of that? That Apollo was kind of like making, I think they got like GraphQL.com, or they grabbed some domain, and the GraphQL team wasn't super excited about this, kind of painting themselves as the GraphQL people. There's also GraphQL, which initially started as like GraphQL as a service, but is also kind of morphed into a framework. I've never personally used it. Joe has. We were talking about it before. I've only heard pretty good and positive things about GraphQL. There's also something called Data Loader, which is by Facebook. It loads data. I have no idea what it does. Use it for GraphQL. And I wanted to point out this MLS article. So the MLS, Major League Soccer, was actually a pretty early adopter of GraphQL, and they did this. they wrote this really great blog post about GraphQL, and what I really loved about it is they sort of have this area here. I'm also a big soccer fan, although more of a... Mark's not here to appreciate this, but English soccer is way better than American soccer. But still.
That's it.
Yeah, it's neither here nor there. But they sort of show you where like something comes from their API and ends up going their UI, and so how they kind of use that model and how GraphQL helped. And one other thing, if anybody knows who Peggy Reyes is, she's a big Apollo person. She does a lot of Apollo talks at conferences. She started, I don't know where she started, but she was at MLS before she went to Apollo. So there's this sort of lineage among MLS about
What's her name?
Peggy Reyes.
Raises?
Not racist. Raise it. R-A-Y-Z-I-S.
All right.
So I highly recommend this article. Really good. And gotta go for the final slide. There you go. Learn GraphQL. Profit. Questions?
Got a question?
Yeah.
So you have your two little microservices, one's comments and one's posts, right?
Right.
Does the GraphQL client-side library or some other magic exist that will give me the join? Or am I going to do...
You do that in the resolver. So that's basically what the resolver is for.
Okay, so how does it know to...
Oh,
do
I see.
that?
I think I see what you're saying.
So if I want to make one call to get my posts with their comments, do I have to do that?
To
with the client?
GraphQL?
Right.
Yeah.
Where each post
Well,
is
You want to get the post and the comments that are related to the post.
as a child of it in the same.
Oh, yeah,
Just
yeah.
write it. That's what GraphQL is for.
Yeah, but you do have to do that in your resolver. So, so in the result, let me show you, because I actually did have
So I was
that.
wondering, like, how does it manage the synchronization of the separate fetches that
I
are
work on the front. I just write the little blob of GraphQL. and I'll just click on it.
So that's what I was asking, is it a client-side problem or is it a server-side problem?
It's not a client-side problem.
Okay.
It's super easy on the client.
Okay, so
literally just
the
write-
assumption is that there's the server layer that's...
Yeah, so let me at least show you how I did it. I'm
stitching
not.
pieces together. Okay.
I'm not saying
Think
this
about
is.
it. Any service that any backend guy is going to build is going to have that. And GraphQL is sitting between whatever the hell they build that lets you get posts that has comments and you. And GraphQL is just making it easier for you to get at that information and to, well, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so let me show you. So in here, oh, I have a console log. Jeez, that's so bad, so bad. Clearly I was debugging something when I was setting up this presentation. So you notice, like, first I'm making a fetch to go get the post by ID, right? And then I have this separate get comments by ID helper function. And so down here I'm also making a fetch to get the comments. So
So you're going to hold up the one, do the other, and then
yeah.
put the results.
So you're generally responsible for deciding how it's going to map to your type. There's no, at least not that I'm aware of, no like hidden magic where you're like, hey, just point at this and give me some data.
I think I just lost track of the division between client and server, that's all.
Oh, sure.
Sorry.
Oh, no worries. No, good question. Anyone else? Questions?
I imagine there's a lot of questions that nobody knows to ask right now.
And like truly, the old cliche of no stupid questions. So if you're like, you're really wondering about something, it's possible I glossed over something or didn't explain something fully that you're like, hey, that didn't quite make sense. Now is definitely a good time to ask.
So in your microservice, where would you make a call, for instance, to a couch database to get the data? Would you make a call to the microservice to get that, or would you do that?
You can do either.
Or do
Right,
that.
so you could, however you're calling CouchDB from like an Express app, right? You could just, because this is just running an Express, right? This is the Express implementation of GraphQL. You would just do whatever you're doing in your Express app in here too, because this is just an Express app that's basically using the GraphQL middleware.
Okay.
That's a good question. At one point I was feeling very ambitious and I was like, you know, I'll do this talk and I'll like, I think I have SQL Server running on my laptop. And I was like, oh, I'll like do a whole SQL database and have this. And then I was like, that's a terrible idea. I have a life. Like, I don't want to do that. much SQL as little as possible.
So do you have any recommendations in terms of learning more? Obviously, you've got a repo there that's available to jump in on. But yeah, where do you get started?
Yeah, good question, Joe. There's a couple things I would recommend. So Josh Black, to give some love to Egghead. There's also this guy did this awesome series of React videos you should check out. Josh Black.
And one on that GraphQL up tool.
What's that?
There's that GraphQL up tool. There's a video of that on Egghead.
Oh, is there?
It's just one. It's a one-off. It's not a
Oh,
series
okay.
or anything. But I mean, it literally, you just write a schema, run a command, and you have a whole GraphQL backend up and running that you can jump in and futz around with.
So there's an option. GraphQL up. There's a GraphQL up is GraphQL, right?
Yeah,
it's one of
for
theirs.
sure. I mean, the end result is a GraphQL service
Oh.
running for you. So yes,
Okay.
Data store and everything.
it's easy. I'll show you that.
Yeah,
It's
We're all gonna have to check that out when we get home. I'm super interested.
I got another question.
Yeah.
Aggregates, do you get any help for max, min, sum?
No.
Or you gotta roll all your own?
You gotta write that yourself.
Because to me, the big bang is somewhere we were just talking before. I'm working on OData. I'm writing a client against OData right now.
I'm sorry.
It works really well because it gives.
I never
you,
said it didn't work. I just
it
said
gives you
I'm
stuff
sorry
like
for having
aggregates.
to do
It
it.
gives you aggregates, right, which is kind of nice. But I'm
True. Yeah. It does. I think there are performance gains too, right, to some of that.
We're still a proof of concept, so we don't
Okay.
care about performance.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, because that's the big benefit is you don't have to keep writing more endpoints. Where it looks like here, if I wanted to have max, I don't know. I'm trying to think of something you would accumulate on there, like total comment characters for each post. So there'd be sum of all the comment characters
like
for each
some
post.
sort of computation in your query.
Right, so
Right.
you'd have to still roll that as all on the GraphQL side
Either one,
and the server.
But like I think you're talking about, like how you used to do in SQL. You could do all sorts
Yeah.
of computation right there in your query. What do you do now?
Yeah.
Well, that's what I say, OData, you just do sum on the URL. You use sum of the thing, and it does it for you.
Some of like the field.
Yeah, the field name. And you can reach down into it. But it is a fairly arcane, you're building up some big ass URLs that you don't have.
Yeah. And it's my problem with it was it's not the easiest to learn, right? You end up with this long query string where you've got like LT and GT and greater than and less than and blah blah blah, all this special syntax, and then, but I don't think that you're still specifying the shape of the data in the way that you are in GraphQL, right?
Well, it looks like you have a lot more power here.
Yeah.
In OData, I'm always just saying, give me everything. So I'm too lazy to select out all the fields.
Right, and I kind of ripped on OData because I just didn't enjoy my experience with it, but there are people who think it's really good. So if for whatever reason you feel like you need OData, go for it, but I wouldn't
You're
recommend
tied
it.
into the Microsoft stack. This is a lot. This was, cross service, any platform. I mean, there's a lot to be said for GraphQL.
Right, and remember this is just a wrapper too, right? So OData is not a wrapper, right? You're still going to have to write OData services. So if you say, if we're an organization, maybe an organization that doesn't have a lot of resources, we don't want to spend a bunch of money having our developers learn OData, which, how much should you really invest in OData? But we got to learn OData, and then we got to write all of our services in OData. I really thought that was one of the things that came out in a couple of talks I watched by the Facebook guys, was they really emphasized this is a wrapper over it. And it almost sounds too good to be true, right? If you look at a traditional REST architecture, what I was talking about with multiple requests and massaging the data, and you'd have to add more endpoints. And here, like you don't have to do any of that. Like whatever REST services you have, it's like the commercial is like, whatever you got, you can keep it. just do this. And so like with GraphQL, it's the same. You just keep on. If you like, what I was thinking of was Obamacare is like, oh, if you like your existing healthcare, you can keep it, and then that didn't really turn out to be true. If you like your existing REST architecture, you can keep it. Just add GraphQL.
And then, I don't know if you mentioned it, but like you were talking about, all these like crazy URLs with GraphQL, the trade-off is now everything is a post, everything. And
That's not true anymore.
That's not true.
No, because my queries are gets, so mutations have to be posts. I thought that too, Joe.
Queries were, how do you do it?
I thought that too, Joe, because I had run into so many issues with that, and I was, if you look at my, so I have.
Yeah, I want to see a network tab, but.
Yeah, I want to say a curl request.
So used to doing command option I. Let's go to network. And here's our header. Oh no, you're right. It is post. Yeah, because I was actually going to put that in the presentation. Then I was messing with it, and in my fetches, I was specifying in that it's a get, and it was working. And I was like, how's that working? Because I always thought everything had to be a post.
Yeah.
Somehow it's working though, even though I'm specifying in fetch that it's a get.
Well, but this is GraphQL as opposed to your real client. This is between you and your GraphQL server. It's not between your GraphQL server and your backend. Depends where you look, right?
It's both, yeah. True.
Yeah, you're getting on your microservices, right?
Yes.
You're posting.
Two.
All I know is, I do believe that's true. If you tell me
That's not true though, because I'm going to port 8,000 and my microservices are on 5,000 5,001. So this is actually from GraphQL to the GraphQL server. Yeah, via the browser. So it's still doing a post. So that is weird. I'm glad you brought that up though, because I
don't know how it would be get. That's a lot of information to be sending it.
Gets with payloads, but it's weird.
Yeah, no, I know.
It's
So
really weird.
doesn't it need a payload to kind of send those instructions?
True.
Like I think that makes sense.
So your mutations are post, which makes sense, but your queries are post, and there's no puts, there's no
patch. We all patched all the time, right?
Yeah.
Have you ever done a patch? Has anybody ever done a patch? I've never.
Sure.
One time I was breaking a joke.
Nice.
If they did the REST API correctly.
Right, exactly. Right, but you have to do Hadioas.
Oh,
Right? And you have to return the right HTTP status code. Right? If you do a, God damn it, Joe, if you do a post that doesn't return a 201, I'm out of here. That's some nerd talk right there. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Aside from remembering this, what good documentation is out there?
So that's a really, really good question, and I want to throw some bouquets Facebook's way because I've always found that their documentation is really, really good. I thought their React documentation's always been really good. Certainly the React documentation was way better than Angular's documentation. Angular's documentation was a trash fire constantly. The React documentation has always been great. Go to GraphQL, I think it's graphql.org. I'll pull it up for you right here. Yeah, graphql.org. Really, really good document. Actually, much of what I showed you is just pretty much what they tell you in the docs. Yeah, and to piggyback on, Joe asked the question earlier, if you want to learn more. Surprisingly, there's a dearth of training videos out there for GraphQL. Josh Black, who works at IBM, did an Egghead course on GraphQL. A lot of what he'll show you is what I showed you. Sometimes my criticism of Egghead is someone will just go right into a video and there's not like enough explanation why. Whereas I think Pluralsight, sometimes their problem is they over-explain. I'm like, God, just get to it.
Yeah.
Sometimes Egghead.
I don't know if Egghead still has the tagline, but it's all, the philosophy is bite-sized videos. Like,
Right.
just here's what you want to know to buy.
Which I've always loved because I have no attention span whatsoever. And so like I look at a 10-minute video and I'm like, no, I just nope the hell out of there. So, but sometimes with Josh's videos in that series, they're like when he jumps to the GraphQL JS. So he starts out doing a string just like I did, and then later in the course he just jumps to that to the JS language implementation, and you're like, why are we doing this now? I don't understand what happened. There's things in there. There's sometimes you'll see there's like a node ID or like a node interface that's in some of these GraphQL. I still don't know what the hell that is. I found a blog post on it and I got bored and stopped reading, so I still don't know what it is. So sometimes there's some things in this ecosystem that are not quite as well explained. Joe, you're a big fan of Apollo, right? I would recommend taking a look at Apollo. I think Apollo simplifies some of this stuff.
Big time. And I mean, for them to get you to use their libraries, they explain away a whole bunch of stuff really succinctly. They're abstracting some stuff, but they'll get you up and running. I
Yeah.
agree with that.
Apollo's really popular right now. Just so you don't have to keep holding your hand up.
It's on top.
I once had a recruiter in the fall. Actually, had a recruiter say, "Hey, we've got this. Nobody knows GraphQL, and you've got GraphQL on your resume. Would you do this?" And they're like, "They're using Apollo." And I didn't take it. Relatively happy where I am. So I didn't take it, but they were using Apollo, and so I think that as companies are starting to go to GraphQL, you'll probably see Apollo rise a little bit.
Well, on topic of like tutorials and stuff, I just found this called How to GraphQL. I guess it's a series of free tutorials.
Yeah, I think I've seen this.
And then you choose like what kind of build stack you want. It's free. By the way.
Oh, real-time updates with GraphQL subscriptions. So
Oh, there it is right there.
there it is.
It's like a lot of them.
Are these videos or are they just like blog posts?
It's like their videos for some of them.
Yeah,
I just
it's
found-
way too much reading for me.
Somebody
Yeah.
out there.
I need
Actually,
videos.
No, there are videos.
I need Joe Matalone videos is what I need.
No, but somebody has like a learnGraphQL.com where it's like an interactive thing. It's been around for a long time.
Oh, really?
Or since,
How to GraphQL.
for 2 years at least. Somebody's got like an
So it has,
online,
like, a video.
if I remember what it is.
It's
I'll
like it
post
uses
it
like
in the
Yeah, post it to
comments.
the
Yeah.
So you just search for the full stack.
How to GraphQL. I don't know how good it is. It's just like,
They don't have a subscription for it.
Anything else?
Yeah, I have one question. Can you
Please.
go back to your example there, in graphical?
In GraphQL, sure.
Yeah. So one of the questions I have is, so you define how to get a post, and you define how to get a comment, and maybe I just missed this part. There's no way without me putting in an additional resolver to get those things at the same, in one trip?
No, yeah, I should have shown you that.
Because that seems like that's the power,
Yeah,
right? I've already
exactly.
shaped this
Yeah.
data for you.
So we could also do this. And also say, sorry, post ID.
for the data.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up, because I think I got a little pressed for time and I wanted to show that. And now the other thing is we can use that fragment. And so now, exactly like you said, in that one round trip.
To
we're
me,
getting
that's like now that's powerful because now if I was in the land I live in where I had to create custom endpoints, I would have to create a custom endpoint to do that and write all that code. Whereas you've modeled it correctly, and now I can do stuff like that.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
cool.
Excellent point. And
You really should have shown that.
I know.
Damn it all.
Can we rewind and like put that in? Everybody.
So I got a question. So okay, so you got this now. Like, let's say you were loading a list of posts and you wanted all other comments. Let's just say you had a bunch
Yeah.
of data and a bunch of related data.
Yeah.
So how would you do that in a way that's performant? Because you wouldn't want to hit your microservices
Like constantly, right?
Mark-
Yeah.
Mark said.
So
It's a great question.
it depends on how you want to implement that in the resolver, essentially. So, and that is one of the, when I was interviewing at Legacy, one of the things they said, I was all excited about GraphQL, and they said, yeah, it's great, but our architect was like, sometimes the problem is you have to return all of the data. So sometimes we talk about it as being an API aggregator. So it kind of sits in front of your APIs and it kind of aggregates them all. So like you just pointed out, like I can get it hit my post service, it hit my comment service, but sometimes you're getting all of this data and then like filtering it down and returning whatever you want.
So it's real friendly to the client, but it may not be that nice to your servers.
Right,
This is-
but that's where you want to offload the performance to, right? Because your servers are generally going to be a lot faster than the client.
And hopefully they're
Because someone pulling up your website on a 3G phone,
Yeah.
now that we're getting into mobile everywhere and mobile apps are everywhere, I want to shift performance to the server. I don't want it on the UI. I mean, within reason, right? We don't want to take 20 seconds.
You want to
on
reduce the
server.
round trips for sure.
Yeah,
I'm
reducing round
making a
trips.
mobile app right now, and that's where I'm
Right.
hitting that constantly.
But
It's
generally,
painful.
like on web apps, like a lot of the problem is in the browser, or often like the payload you're giving to the browser. So if you can shift that to the server, then you've mitigated some of that. Yeah.
So this is still your get post query. This is still basically two requests to your microservice. So like a
Yep.
request to get the post.
Yeah. So this is going to call both resolvers. So this is going to call the post resolver and the comment resolver, and those are both going to hit the API. Those individual APIs. At Legacy, so legacy.com does obituaries, and we have online obits, and there's lots of data. When someone dies, what we do. Always bring death into a presentation. Because life is meaningless.
Beat that up.
Yeah, exactly. I should have led with death. So death. But anyway, so in an obituary, there's like lots of data. There's like family and blah, 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 and often those are in a newspaper, so we might have to get like newspaper information. And so we have GraphQL queries that are like scroll down and scroll down and scroll down, and those are all hitting different microservices. So we could have like a 6 microservice call within one GraphQL query. And so 1 round trip to the server, but 6 calls from the server to those microservices, where generally they're going to be on the same network, so the traffic's going to be a lot faster.
Is that done in parallel, like each individual call to microservices?
Great question. So
Depends on your resolver, right?
Yeah, you gotta get
yeah,
good.
exactly. Depends on your resolver.
You've been paying attention, sir.
Yeah. Your question made me think of something that I glossed over in this. So in queries within GraphQL, I don't, it, like you said, like it sort of depends.
We're gonna have to wrap up. Like we can continue having conversations, or
Sure.
we have to start.
Yeah, sure.
Things up.
So
Okay.
just to finish your question, so on the GraphQL side, queries run in parallel, but mutations do not. And there's a reason for that, because what if we're running 3 different mutations at the same time, and 2 of them are hitting the same data? And now we've got a race condition.
Right.
So so your mutations will run one after the other, but your queries can run in parallel. All right.
That was great.
Thank you, Todd.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, for organizing.
Hey, Adam. You're welcome.
And
Did you
digital
flip on the light?
primates,
And digital
analog
primates,
monkeys,
PSC
and
groups.